The quiet, stormed night was calm, but Sandra Bullock could not rest. The city outside her window glowed with restless lights, and yet inside her heart there was a heavier glow, one filled with questions she could not silence. For years she had carried herself with courage, with grace, with the kind of strength people admired from a distance. But strength, she knew, was often misunderstood. People thought it meant never falling apart, never breaking. But tonight, as she sat alone with her thoughts, she felt the truth pressing in. Strength was about carrying the weight of fear and doubt without letting it crush you. And tonight, her fear was heavy. Earlier that day, she had faced a decision that could change the course of her career. A project had been offered to her, but it came with risks she had not expected. The script was raw, filled with pain and resilience, and her role demanded that she dig deep into wounds she had tried to hide. People around her whispered that she should not take it. They said it was too heavy, too dangerous for her image. But her heart told her something different. Her heart told her this was not about image, it was about truth, and truth required courage. As she wrestled with this decision, she thought of the people she had met in her journey, the ones who stood tall even when life bent them low. She thought of single mothers, of quiet workers, of children who had faced loss but still smiled. These were the faces that gave her courage. But still, courage did not silence fear. It only gave her the strength to walk forward despite it. It was in this moment of quiet storm that her phone buzzed. The name that appeared on the screen made her pause. Keanu Reeves. He was not just a colleague. He was not just a friend. He was someone who understood silence, someone who carried his own storms with a gentleness that made others feel safe. She answered, and his voice, low and calm, filled the room. "I heard about the script," he said. "Are you okay?" She tried to laugh, but her voice cracked. "Everyone thinks it is too much. Maybe they are right." There was a pause, the kind of pause that did not feel empty. Keanu had a way of letting silence speak. "Finally," he said, "too much for who? For them, maybe, but not for you." His words were simple, but they cut through her doubt. Still, she argued, what if I fail? What if I am not strong enough? This time, his voice softened. "Strength isn't about knowing the outcome, Sandra. It's about being willing to try when no one else believes you can. Courage doesn't erase fear, it walks with it, and I've seen you do that before." She sat in silence, tears rising in her eyes. She had always been the one who people leaned on, the one who offered comfort. But tonight, Keanu's voice was the anchor she needed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with speeches. It was quiet, steady, gentle strength. And that was enough to hold her together. The conversation stretched into the night. They spoke not of fame or cameras, but of life, of loss, of the fragile lines that held people together. Keanu shared a memory, one of his lowest days, when he had felt too broken to move forward. He didn't share it to draw sympathy. He shared it to show that pain could shape, but it did not have to destroy. "The world only sees the surface," he said quietly, "but it's what we carry inside that makes us human. And sometimes, it's the broken places that let the light in." Those words stayed with Sandra long after the call ended. When she finally closed her eyes, the city lights still glowed outside, but inside her heart, there was a shift. The fear was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a gentle strength that reminded her she was not alone. Tomorrow, she would make her choice. Tomorrow, she would face the voices that doubted her. But tonight, she carried with her the quiet storm, and the voice of a friend who had reminded her of what true courage meant. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would test them both in ways they could not yet imagine. The decision and the storm ahead. The morning sun poured through the thin curtains of Sandra's room, but it felt colder than usual. She sat at the edge of her bed, holding the script in her hands as though it was both a gift and a burden. The Pages were worn from her restless fingers flipping back and forth through them all night. Every line of dialogue demanded more than performance, it demanded honesty. It asked her to open wounds she had never wanted to share with the world. Outside, the world of Hollywood buzzed with whispers. Calls had already started. Producers wanted answers. Her agent urged her to think twice. The media had caught wind of the script and was already building stories about whether Sandra Bullock was ready for such a raw role. Everyone had an opinion, and none of them felt safe. But inside her heart, a different voice echoed the one from the night before. Keanu. Words had not faded. Strength isn't about knowing the outcome. It's about being willing to try. It was strange how a few quiet words could weigh more than the loudest voices around her. With a deep breath, she closed the script and whispered to herself, "I will do it." It was not just a decision about work. It was a decision about who she wanted to be. And once spoken aloud, her chest felt lighter. The day rushed forward, filled with phone calls and meetings. People pushed back. Her agent, looking frustrated, warned her about risks to her reputation. This role could change how people see you, and not in the way you want. Are you sure? Sandra looked her in the eye and said softly, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's time people see something real." But making the decision did not end the fear. In fact, it seemed to grow. That night, after the storm of calls, Sandra drove to a quiet place on the edge of the city, a small cafe she knew would be nearly empty. When she walked in, she saw him, Keanu, sitting at a corner table, a mug of coffee untouched, lost in thought. It felt like fate that he was there. When he saw her, his face softened, the way it always did when words were not needed. She sat across from him, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was grounding. Finally she broke. I said yes." His lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile that held pride and quiet understanding. "Then you're already stronger than you think." She leaned back, the weight of the day pressing down again. "What if I don't live up to it? What if they tear me apart?" Keanu looked at her, his eyes steady. "They might. The world can be cruel when it doesn't understand. But you don't have to carry it alone." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He took a slow breath, his gaze drifting for a moment, as if remembering something far away. "When I lost people close to me, the world kept moving. No one stopped to see the weight I was carrying. I had to learn that strength isn't about walking alone. It's about letting someone walk with you. If you let me, I'll walk with you through this." The words struck her deeper than she expected. Here was a man who had carried pain so quietly, offering her something she did not know. She needed partnership. Not in the professional sense, but in the human sense. The cafe grew quieter as the night stretched on. The storm outside began to pour, rain tapping against the glass. And in that sound, Sandra felt a strange calm. Storms could be frightening, but they could also wash things clean. Before they left, Keanu placed his hand over hers, not in a way that claimed, but in a way that steadied. "Whatever happens, remember this. Your courage doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be true. And I'll be here, reminding you of that when you forget." As she drove home through the rain, she realized something. The role, the doubts, the risks, they were only part of the journey. The deeper story was about what she would discover along the way. And though she did not know it yet, this choice would not only test her courage, but also weave her path with Keanu's in ways that would change them both forever. The weight of the world news spread quickly, faster than Sandra expected. By morning, headlines lit up across every platform. "Sandra Bullock takes on dangerous role." Some praised her bravery, but others tore at her decision with sharp words. Critics questioned if she could handle it. They speculated that her career was nearing its end, and that this was a desperate attempt to stay relevant. Sandra read the articles in silence. Each word felt heavier than the last. She had always known the world could be harsh, but this felt personal. For a moment, she wondered if she had made the wrong choice. Doubt began to creep back in, its claws sharp and cold. She sat in her kitchen, the morning light spilling over the table, the untouched cup of tea cooling in front of her. She felt the walls closing in, the noise outside pressing against her chest. Then her phone buzzed. Another message. She expected more criticism, but when she opened it, her breath caught. It was from Keanu. Dawn, don't single quotes too long. They don't know your heart. Remember, storms pass, but your truth will remain. Just reading those lines steadied her. He had a way of saying what she needed before she even asked. Later that day they met again, this time on a quiet trail just outside the city. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the sound of their footsteps filled the silence between them. Sandra looked out at the trees, her voice low. It feels like the whole world is against me. Keanu glanced at her, his eyes calm, almost reflective. The world doesn't matter as much as you think. They'll speak today, forget tomorrow, and move on to someone else. What matters is whether you can live with yourself if you walk away. Her chest tightened. But the fear, it doesn't go away. Every voice, every doubt, it just gets louder. He stopped walking, turning to face her. Fear never goes away. I feel it too. Every time I step into something new, I feel it. But I've learned that fear only grows when you run from it. When you stand still, look it in the eye, it begins to shrink. Sandra studied his face, the steady way he held himself. She wondered how many storms he had faced alone, how many times he had stood in silence while the world demanded he bend. They walked further, the trail winding higher, until they reached a cliff that overlooked the valley. Below, the city stretched wide, glowing faintly under the soft gray sky. Standing there, Sandra felt small, yet strangely stronger. She whispered, almost to herself, "Sometimes I just want someone to tell me I'm not crazy for doing this." Keanu's voice came gently beside her. "You're not crazy, you're brave. And bravery often looks like madness to people who never dare." She looked at him then, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time in days. She smiled not because her fears were gone, but because she finally believed she was not alone in them. As they stood side by side, a sudden wind rushed across the cliff, carrying with it the scent of rain. Sandra shivered slightly, but Keanu's presence beside her felt like a steady wall against the storm, and in that moment, a quiet truth began to form between them. It was not just about a role or a script anymore. It was about two people learning that courage becomes stronger when shared, and that sometimes the weight of the world is easier to bear when someone chooses to stand beside you. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both knew the journey ahead was only beginning, and the challenges waiting would demand more from them than either could imagine. The Fire Begins' first day on set arrived with more weight than Sandra expected. The studio lot was alive with movement technicians rolling cables, directors giving instructions, cameras being adjusted. It should have felt like any other film, but it didn't. This one was different. This one felt like walking into a storm that had no promise of shelter. As Sandra walked through the doors of the soundstage, every eye seemed to follow her. Whispers moved across the room like shadows. Some smiled politely, others watched with silent judgment. She knew what they were thinking. They wondered if she would crumble under the pressure. She clutched her script tightly, her fingers trembling despite the calm mask she wore. Inside, her chest ached with nerves. Every step felt heavier than the last. The director approached her, his face stern but kind. "We're starting with the hardest scene," he said quietly, almost as if testing her resolve. "Are you ready?" She nodded, though her throat felt dry. The scene was raw. It required her to break down, to let the world see a side of her she had always guarded. It was not just acting, it was exposing herself. As she took her place on set, she spotted him in the corner. Keanu, he was not part of the film, but he had come anyway. standing quietly near the crew, his presence steady, like a lighthouse in the fog. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, she felt something shift inside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence reminded her that she was not standing alone. The cameras rolled. The silence stretched. And then, it began. Sandra poured herself into the scene, every word tearing open old scars she had hidden for years. Her voice cracked. Her body trembled. But she kept going. The tears were not fake. They were real. When the director finally called cut, the room was silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Then slowly, the crew began to clap, not out of habit, but out of awe. For a moment, Sandra stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. Then she glanced toward the corner. Keanu's eyes met hers, filled with quiet pride, and he gave the smallest nod. But not everyone was moved. Outside the set, whispers began to twist. Tabloids caught wind of her emotional performance and spun it cruelly. Is Sandra Bullock falling apart on set? One headline read. Others painted her vulnerability as weakness, suggesting she was losing control. That night, Sandra sat in her car after leaving the studio, staring at the glowing words on her phone screen. The world outside didn't understand what she was trying to do. They didn't see the courage it took to stand bare. They only saw what they wanted. A knock on her window startled her. She looked up and saw Keanu standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. She rolled down the window, her eyes damp. "Long day," he said simply, handing her the cup. She took it, her hands brushing his. "They think I'm breaking," she whispered. He leaned slightly against the car, his voice calm. "Let them think. Breaking isn't the end. Sometimes breaking is the beginning of becoming real." Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to believe them, but the fear still lingered. He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "Sandra, people fear honesty because it reminds them of their own walls. What you did today, it wasn't weakness. It was the kind of strength that terrifies people who only know how to hide." His words sank deep, softening the weight inside her chest. That night, as she drove home, the city lights flickering past her windows, she realized something important. Courage was not about silence or perfection. It was about standing open even when the world chose to misunderstand. And though the days ahead promised more storms, she knew that somewhere in the chaos, Keanu would be there, his quiet strength, reminding her that resilience was not about standing alone, but about standing true. The breaking point weeks rolled on, and each day felt like a test Sandra had not studied for. Filming pushed her to the edge of exhaustion. The role demanded she pour herself out in every scene, and though her performances grew stronger, so did the whispers around her. Every magazine, every blog, every voice online seemed to hold an opinion about her life, her choices, her strength. Some called her courageous. Others mocked her openly, saying she had lost touch, that she was desperate to stay relevant. It was a cruel game of tug-of-war between praise and ridicule. And Sandra was caught in the middle. But the hardest blow came one evening when a headline spread across every screen. "Bullock breaks down on set again, crew grows worried." The article was filled with twisted stories, none of them true. They claimed she was unstable, that she could not handle the pressure, that she was dragging the entire production down. Sandra read the words alone in her trailer. Her chest grew tight, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the comments beneath the article. Strangers, people who had never met her, tore her apart with words sharper than knives. The door to her trailer creaked open, and Keanu stepped in. Quietly, he had been visiting more often now, a quiet presence who never demanded her attention, but always seemed to know when she needed it. He saw the phone in her hand, the tears in her eyes, and without a word, he sat down beside her. "They think I'm falling apart," she whispered, her voice raw. He looked at her gently. "You are not falling apart. You are opening. An opening looks messy to people who are afraid of it." She shook her head. But what if they are right? What if I am not strong enough? Keanu's eyes were steady, his tone calm but firm. Strength is not about never breaking. It's about what you do after. It's about choosing to stand again when everything inside you wants to stay down. And Sandra, I have seen you stand more times than you realize. His words should have comforted her, but that night the weight was too heavy. She pressed her face into her hands and let the tears fall, and Keanu did not try to stop them. He did not tell her to be strong. He just sat with her, silent, present, steady. It was not grand or loud, but it was what she needed. The next day, filming brought an unexpected test. One of her co-stars, frustrated by the delays caused by the media frenzy, snapped at her in front of the crew. His words cut deep. Maybe they're right. Maybe you can't handle this. The set went silent. Everyone froze, waiting to see how she would react. Sandra's heart pounded, her throat dry. For a moment, she wanted to walk away. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him, Keanu, standing at the edge of the set. His arms crossed, his gaze steady. He didn't speak, but his presence reminded her she was not alone. She took a slow breath, lifted her head, and answered, calmly, maybe I will stumble, maybe I will break down, but I will not stop, not until I finish what I came here to do. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Her co-star had no response. The director simply nodded, his eyes shining with quiet respect. That night, as the crew wrapped up, Keanu walked beside her toward her car. The air was cool, the stars hidden behind clouds. She glanced at him, her voice soft. What if this breaks me for real? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then I will be there to help you gather the pieces, and together, we'll build something stronger. His words lingered in her chest as she drove home, the city lights blurring past. She realized something powerful. Strength was not about carrying everything alone. It was about letting someone stand beside you, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise. And though she did not yet know it, the days ahead would bring a moment that would test them both beyond anything they had faced so far. The collapse and the light set was heavy with tension. Weeks of pressure had built up until it felt like the air itself was ready to shatter. Every step Sandra took was followed by whispers. Every glance from the crew seemed sharper than before. The role was draining her, pulling raw emotions from places she had tried to bury. On one particular morning, the director announced they would film the most difficult scene yet. It was the breaking point of her character, a moment that demanded complete vulnerability. As the cameras rolled, Sandra gave everything she had. Her voice shook, her body trembled, and tears streamed freely. It was real, raw, unguarded. When the director called cut, silence filled the room. The crew looked at her, not with respect, but with unease. Someone muttered under their breath, "She's too far gone." Another whispered, "This isn't acting anymore. It's dangerous." Their words echoed in her mind like a cruel chorus. Before she could stop herself, she stumbled off set, rushing to her trailer. Once inside, the dam broke. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing until her chest ached. Keanu found her minutes later. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and stepped inside, his face tight with concern. Seeing her curled on the couch, broken, tore at him. He crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I can't do this," she gasped through tears. "They think I'm losing my mind. Maybe they're right." He leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "Listen to me. You are not losing yourself. You are showing them what it means to feel, and that scares them. It's easier to mock what they don't understand than to admit they are afraid of their own pain." She shook her head violently. "But it hurts too much. I don't know if I can keep going." Keanu's eyes softened. "Then let me carry some of it with you." Her gaze lifted to his, searching, trembling. "Why do you stay? Why do you keep showing up for me? He held her eyes, his voice quiet but firm. Because I know what it's like to fall apart alone, and I swore I would never let someone I cared about go through that if I could help it. The room grew still. The storm inside her chest slowed, not gone, but steadied by his words. But the world outside gave no mercy. Later that week, a leaked video of her emotional breakdown on set spread online. Headlines screamed Sandra Bullock unstable production at risk. The criticism was cruel, relentless, louder than ever before. This time, though, Sandra did not face it alone. Keanu stood beside her, not in front of cameras, but in the quiet moments that mattered. When her phone buzzed with hate, he gently took it from her and set it aside. When she doubted her strength, he reminded her of every step she had already taken. And then came the unexpected twist. During a private screening of raw footage, the studio executives sat in silence as Sandra's performance played out on the screen. What the world called weakness, they saw as brilliance. When the lights came up, one of them whispered, almost reverent, "This is not acting. This is truth. This will change everything." The decision was made. The film would move forward, unshaken by the noise outside. But the moment that mattered most came after the meeting, when Sandra walked out of the screening room and found Keanu waiting in the hall. Her eyes were damp, but not from fear, this time from relief. "They finally see it," she whispered. Keanu smiled faintly. "They're only catching up to what I already knew." For the first time in weeks, she laughed softly, the sound fragile, but real. In that moment, she realized something. The storms, the doubt, the pain, all of it had been leading her to this truth. Courage was not about being unbreakable. It was about being willing to break and still rise again. And with Keanu's gentle strength beside her, she felt ready for whatever came next. The quiet triumphants passed, and the storm around the film only grew. Every magazine, every blog, every critic seemed to circle like vultures, waiting for the project to collapse. But through the noise, Sandra kept going. She poured herself into every scene, each performance pulling from the deepest parts of her soul. There were days she felt hollow, days she felt fragile, but Keanu never let her walk alone. He was there on the long nights when her body trembled from exhaustion. He was there when doubt whispered that she was not enough. And most importantly, he was there in silence, no speeches, no grand gestures, just presence, steady and unshaken. His gentle strength became the ground beneath her feet. Then came the day of the premiere. The theater was filled with flashing cameras, the red carpet lined with reporters hungry for a headline. Sandra stepped out of the car, her heart pounding harder than it ever had before. This was the moment when the world would finally see what she had carried inside for so long. As she walked past the noise of cameras and voices, she felt a familiar presence beside her. Keanu, dressed simply, calm as always, walked just a step behind. He wasn't there for the cameras. He wasn't there for the spectacle. He was there for her. Inside the theater, the lights dimmed, and the film began. Sandra sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As her performance unfolded on the screen, she felt exposed all over again. Every scene was a mirror of her own fears and struggles. She wondered if the audience would understand, or if they would see her as broken. When the film ended, there was silence. Her chest tightened. Then, slowly, the silence broke not with polite applause, but with something deeper. The audience rose to their feet, the sound of their clapping filling the room, echoing like thunder. It was not just approval. It was recognition. Tears welled in Sandra's eyes as she stood, her body trembling with release. For the first time, she felt seen not as an actress, not as an image, but as a human being. She turned slightly, her eyes finding Keanu across the room. He wasn't clapping the loudest, but his gaze held something stronger than any cheer: pride, respect, and a quiet reminder of every step she had taken to reach this moment. Later, as the night faded and the theater emptied, Sandra and Keanu stood together under the soft glow of the streetlights. The noise of the world felt far away. She looked at him, her voice trembling but steady. "I couldn't have done this without you." He shook his head gently. "You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." Her eyes softened, her chest heavy with gratitude. "Why do you always know the right thing to say?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Because sometimes the right words are the quiet ones." They stood in silence, the night calm around them, and for the first time in months, Sandra felt peace. The storms had passed, not because the world had grown kinder, but because she had found the courage to stand true, and because someone had chosen to stand beside her. The film went on to be more than a success. Critics who once doubted her called it one of the bravest performances of her career. But for Sandra, the real triumph was not in the headlines or the awards. It was in the journey itself, the nights of fear, the days of doubt, and the quiet strength that carried her through. She had discovered that courage was not loud, not unbreakable, not flawless. Courage was fragile, messy, human. And sometimes, courage was found not in standing alone, but in letting someone's gentle strength steady your own. As the months turned into years, that truth stayed with her, a quiet reminder that storms will always combat with courage, humility, and kindness. The storms could be faced, and with someone like Keanu beside her, she knew she would never face them alone again.